So I expect you know about our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who's had quite a bit of attention. First up as at that time when she was elected, the world's youngest female leader. Now she's been toppled from that perch more recently by the Prime Minister of Finland, who's astonishingly only 34. And then more recently in the news, because of our relative success in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. And we can talk more about both of those subjects later. So what I'd like to cover in my little address is first give you a few facts and figures just to locate us in context, but I can tell by the social chat at first that a number of you have already visited New Zealand and probably know a great deal about us. I'd like to pick out too a few highlights from our 182-year history of friendship, and then perhaps a little bit on what New Zealand, although a distant and a smaller country, what we can do to bring value in the relationship with the United States. And then a few surprises, a few things about New Zealand that you may not necessarily know. And finally, the best part of the program, and that is engaging with you through your questions and our discussion together. So just starting off with those few facts and figures, for those of you who don't know us so well, we're a country of just over 5 million people. So that comparative terms in the US locates us comparable to South Carolina. In US dollar terms, our GDP is 204 billion, and I actually don't have a really good comparison for that. And in terms of land mass, we are just over 103,000 square miles. Well, you can tell from that it's not by population size, economic strength, or even military might that we can have influence on the global stage. But I believe we do have some influence. We've got a well-earned and very positive reputation for being a country that pulls its weight. We also have progressive social policies. And I think over the years, we've made a disproportionate contribution to the intellectual and social life beyond our shores. Like the US, we're very proud to be one of the world's longest continuous democracies. In our case, not nearly as old as you, of course, and not as old as Switzerland, but we do go back to 1852, so that's not too bad. Just in terms of our long history of friendship, we can say 182 years because the US sent its first consul to New Zealand in 1838. And since we're close to the inauguration of the next president, I calculated how many presidents New Zealand has worked with throughout our history, and we've actually worked with 38. So when we began that official relationship, your 8th president was in the White House, and we're now up to, of course, the 45th. So just coming back to our early history, James Clendon was the first consul that was sent to New Zealand. And at that time, the sort of seat of government was in the Bay of Islands, north of Auckland. Excuse me a moment. He's rather a stern-looking gentleman. We've got a pen portrait of him, which is hanging in our residence. And I expect he had a rather tough time because the whalers and others who were traveling in those times were perhaps not all gentlemanly types. He would have been present in 1840 when the first US ship came to our shores, and that was the USS, well, I would say, having been ambassador in France, Vincennes. I think you may say normally here Vincent, I'm not sure. But anyway, that was the ship that was carrying the Wilkes expedition back from exploring in the Antarctica, looking for a sea passage. And just to digress a little on the explorer Charles Wilkes, the Smithsonian site describes him as the most undeservedly forgotten of American explorers because he did actually discover and map a great chunk of the Antarctica. And if you can imagine doing that in a frail little sailing ship in a sea of ice, it was really an extraordinary feat. And then coming back through the Pacific, they collected also in New Zealand a great deal of cultural material as well as plant material, engaged with Maori, and a number of these items, the first treasures really that were brought back for the Smithsonian, which was in its infancy at that time, are still stored there. I had the privilege, and I really am digressing, I'll come back to the main line, I had the privilege of seeing some of the korowai or Maori cloaks that the Wilkes expedition brought back from that 1840 visit to New Zealand, stored out there very carefully in the Smithsonian archives. But back to that early those early contacts between the United States and New Zealand. The next visit of a ship actually came almost immediately after the Civil War here, and that was the USS Kearsarge that came to us in 1869 and made a great impression, especially with the engineers of our young country at that time, because it was steam powered. So those very early contacts have been largely forgotten now, but they did lay the foundation stones for a friendship that flourished right through the 20th century and, of course, into the current 21st century. I would say, too, that New Zealanders of my parents' generation remained extremely grateful to the United States for coming to our support and protection during the Second World War, when it was no longer possible for the United Kingdom to offer that protection after the fall of Singapore. And so that was, for that generation and mine, something that we remain very grateful for. Since those really dark days of World War II, New Zealand has, actually right before, so going right back in our history from World War I on, New Zealand has fought in every major conflict alongside the US. So we feel that as a smaller country, we have deserved our reputation for being ready to make our own contribution to world peace and stability. Which really brings me to the point about what it is that New Zealand can offer to the United States in troubled times. And we certainly seem to have in the world our share of troubles just at the moment. There's no doubt we're in a tumultuous period of our history. Partly that's caused by the disruptions of rapid technological progress and change. It's certainly caused by shifts in the global power balance. We've yet to see the end of that. And all around the world, of course, particularly in our Pacific Islands near region, we're seeing the impacts of climate change. And on top of that, and many more challenges that I know you could add to my list, we're all having to deal with the pandemic, the worst that anyone alive today has experienced. So in these times of uncertainty, even danger, it's natural for us as humans to turn to others that we already know and trust. And that's certainly been the case in our Five Eyes group, that is United States, New Zealand, UK, Australia, and Canada. So in these past months, we've had an even closer relationship than we normally do with these, our most trusted partners. And so it's really been a difficult period, but despite the disparities in size, I think we can still do a lot of things together. And just backtracking a little bit to 2019, you'll recall that we had a very, very appalling experience in Christchurch in New Zealand with the mosque shootings, the terrorist attack on 2 mosques that left 51 people dead. And that was a time when we really were very, very grateful for the support that the United States gave us, because almost immediately after that news was flashed through, we had offers of help from the FBI and other US security agencies helping us to put some more information around the killer to find out whether it was likely that he was acting on his own or maybe there was more to follow. And that was really did help us a lot. And then this year, responding to the pandemic, we've had even closer policy dialogues with the US than we normally have at the senior level, at our level of ministers, talking about all manner of topics, including food security and the safety of global supply chains. Also, at a very practical level this past year, New Zealand has a company called Fisher and Paykel Healthcare, which probably now for several decades has been supplying very specialized respiratory equipment to United States hospitals and clinics. And so naturally, their products were under big demand. So they've stepped up their supply this past, well, ever since the pandemic hit, to be able to meet the demand from the US. And also at the early stages of the pandemic, our biggest dairy company, Fonterra, answered an emergency call from here in the US for a huge supply of a very specific kind of dried milk powder called whey hydrolysates. It's used in liquid food for people who are in ICU. And this was right at the end of our last summer in the Southern Hemisphere of our dairy season. But Fonterra realized that this was such an important and urgent need that they held a whole factory open for another month so that they could fill the order, which was a massive one. So these are practical ways that our very long friendship brings us together in very troubled and difficult times. And we can certainly rely on each other when the chips are down. Just a few surprises about New Zealand. If you or your family, some of you have visited, you'll know that we're a great country to visit. We're just really sorry that for the time being, because of the pandemic, our borders are closed, and we're looking forward very much to that day when we can welcome tourists back. We very much value the quite large numbers of visitors who come from the United States. But our tourist promotion organisation in the meantime is doing their level best to keep alive the dream of going to New Zealand for those people who haven't already come down to discover us, but who have us on their so-called bucket list. I've never quite understood that expression. I hope somebody listening can elucidate me later, because after all, who puts a list in a bucket? But never mind. So we do pride ourselves on being an open, diverse and welcoming society, but it may be a surprise, as it is to a lot of people, to know that we also are a country of 160 different ethnicities and 200 languages. Now that might sound a whole lot more like New York, but that's the kind of country that we've become. And approaching 1/3 of our current population are people who were not born in New Zealand. That would be probably the first time in our history since the early days of colonization that could be truly said. Maori, as the indigenous people, comprise about 16% of our total population. The next largest group is people of Asian descent or background. Many of them actually have come in recent decades, but we also have had a long-standing Asian population, as you had, from the 19th century. And then our third largest ethnic group is from the Pacific Islands, and that's 8%. And all of those groups are growing. Now, since we had here in the US last year the celebration of the centenary of the 19th Amendment giving women the vote, I have to do a little brag and check whether some of you listening were probably already aware of this, but knew that New Zealand was actually the first independent country to give women the vote, and we date back to 1893. But there is a US connection to that early record, and it's quite an interesting one. Unfortunately, this lady, like Charles Wilkes, has been now largely forgotten, but she set out from San Francisco in 1884 called Mary Levitt, and she was representing the US Women's Christian Temperance Organization. So she boldly struck out on a sailing ship for New Zealand and then travelled the length of the country, no mean feat in those times, preaching the two gospels really of hers, temperance on the one hand, but suffrage, universal suffrage on the other. And her success was that she encouraged women in New Zealand at that time to set up their own organisations, their own women's groups, and their own methods of pressuring the then all-male parliament to allow women the vote. Now, Mary Levitt eventually left us again after about a year of setting up these networks for women. Now, she didn't succeed on the temperance. We never went for that one. But the suffrage groups outlasted her visit. And after another decade, nearly a decade of pressure, we were successful. So coming back to the present, and a few more surprising facts about New Zealand. At a time when public trust around the democratic Western world and government has been eroding, actually in New Zealand, we've succeeded in having that public trust stay very strong. A Comma Brunton poll last August, this of course just a few months after the full impact of the early months of the pandemic. This poll asked people what degree of confidence did they have in the New Zealand government to deal with the pandemic. And actually 88% of them said that they trusted the government to make the best decisions on the pandemic. And it wasn't just on that, it wasn't just COVID-19 related. When they were asked, well, what degree of trust do you have in the government to solve other national level problems, such as climate change, etc., there was still a very high 83% of full confidence. Now, we in New Zealand were one of the first liberal democracies after the pandemic to conduct a general election, which we did on the 17th of October. And the turnout, it's voluntary for us, the turnout rate was also very high. It was 82.5. Now, that's not actually dramatically different. And when I was growing up, it was generally over 90%. But in recent times, it's higher. And even for young people who are usually in all of our societies not that motivated, between the ages of 18 and 25, the turnout rate for our latest October election was around 84%. And that was something of a record for that younger group. I don't think we can claim that we do our civics education particularly well in New Zealand, but we clearly have been doing some things right to instill the belief or the acceptance that if you're privileged to live in a fully functioning democracy, there are responsibilities as well as those privileges, and voting is certainly one of those responsibilities. Now, on a really different topic, another surprise about present-day New Zealand is that we're now a partner for the United States in space cooperation. Now, if you thought about New Zealand, you might classically think about dairy cows or Lord of the Rings spectacular landscapes or bungee jumping or maybe Sauvignon Blanc, but you probably don't think about rocket launching. But that's actually what's happening. Since 2018, a company called Rocket Lab, which literally started out in a garage in Auckland 12 years ago and is now actually converted into a US-based company with a New Zealand subsidiary. So since the end of 2018, they've been successfully launching rockets into low orbit from a remote peninsula on the east coast, the Mahia Peninsula, east coast of the North Island. It's a commercial operation, and they've been successful in getting contracts from the United States Air Force, from NASA, and from other of your security agencies. That's facilitated or enabled by the fact that as a Five Eyes partner, we have a space technology agreement which provides the kind of security assurance to your agencies that our company can properly handle their material. So to finish the surprises on a tastier note, what about New Zealand peanut butter? Doesn't that seem an outrage to bring peanut butter to the land that, well, actually, I understand the Canadians originally invented peanut butter, but it was certainly perfected here and is probably the food that people all around the world associate most with the United States after hamburgers. So another little brave company, this one originating at a bowling club in Wellington only 6 or 7 years ago, called Fix and Fog, decided that they would launch their product in the United States. Now they pride themselves, or they market themselves as having the ambition to be the world's best nut butter producer. And I can tell you, as an enthusiastic consumer of Fix and Fog peanut butter, it is really, really good, and you can buy it on Amazon. So if anybody's a peanut butter fan out there, I really encourage you to try their version called Smoke and Fire, which is quite unlike any other peanut butter I've ever eaten or ever seen anywhere. So it's smoked peanuts and a touch of chili. Really good. Now, from peanut butter to something rather more serious as we progress, there's one essentially important topic, of course, on all of our minds, and that's impossible to have a conversation with anybody these days without getting to COVID. And there has been a lot of interest here in the US about how did New Zealand manage to be one of very few countries that has almost managed to eliminate the pandemic so far. I should immediately caveat that because we're only just now getting the first cases picked up in our quarantine facilities so far of the more complicated variant that's come in from the UK. So I think, we do have to thank our government for being pretty quick off the mark and being prepared to take some very difficult, very radical decisions back late last March. But our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, is the first to be humble about our relative success and to acknowledge that we did have a number of natural advantages. We are a distant island. Our nearest neighbour is 3.5 hours, 3 hours flying away in Australia. We are a population of only 5 million. We do have one central government, so it's relatively easy to quickly make decisions, set standards, set rules, get instructions out to the entire population. And being rather still a small population, there's still a kind of a community atmosphere. So when the Prime Minister appealed to the country back last March to stay safe, stay home, be kind, and to be a team of 5 million looking after each other, people did pretty much just that. It was also a case that the communications was handled extremely well. Maybe partly because our Prime Minister's academic qualification is in communications, and she's certainly able to put into practice what she studied back at university. So she and her cabinet colleagues were very accessible every day alongside the scientific advisors and the Director General of Health. There was a daily briefing at 1 o'clock. Everybody knew that was coming, and the communication was very honest and open. From the outset, the government stated that their top objective, of course, was to save lives. Secondly, to minimize economic disruption and to retain as best as possible international linkages. Now that one has been the most difficult and is what is now coming home to really challenge us and our economy. And their fourth objective, and this is a very important one, was to communicate in a way that would empower and encourage the community to take responsibility for their own safety. And that really pretty much happened. So, as I've acknowledged, the health dimension of the pandemic, yes, we've done pretty well, and we just hope that we can continue to do so. But the economic impact has been really hard. Not as hard, actually, as our Treasury was predicting last April or May, but still unfolding. And the government decided quite early in the piece that they would launch a really comprehensive recovery package or support package. And that was done back in May, a massive New Zealand dollars 50 billion, which was about a quarter of our GDP. And so that jolted our official debt ratio from a really, really good 19% of GDP right up to over 50%. Now, I know 50% is still pretty good compared with a lot of countries, but for us, it's going to be a constraint on our economy for some time. And I'd already touched on the fact that we rely a lot on tourism. In fact, our export receipts from tourism now rival those from dairy, and we just cannot have those welcome visitors come to our shores yet. So there's going to be an ongoing challenge for us. So looking ahead to where we are as we start on 2021, I think all of us were really happy to turn our backs on 2020, hoping for a better year this coming year. And let's hope eventually that's what we get. For us in New Zealand, we've got two big things happening. The first of those, which is interesting for a sailing city like Annapolis, is that we're hosting this year, right now, the America's Cup sailing contest in Auckland. Now, Auckland is known as the city of sails, and I'm sure that Annapolis should be known as another city of sails. The last time we hosted the Cup was in 1995, and that was a very different setting. No COVID problems to worry about. It was a wonderful month-long big party in Auckland with lots and lots of visitors from offshore, billionaires in their super yachts, the international sailing media, and many, many visitors who took the opportunity to watch the Cup and then travel off around the country. So it's really disappointing for us that we can't have that same fanfare this time, but it will be televised worldwide. Practice racing is already underway. I'm told by people in Auckland that there is already a really nice, festive, happy atmosphere. And we're very fortunate in New Zealand at the moment that there are virtually no COVID constraints. I mean, people are living a largely normal life and able to go out and go to restaurants and watch events like the America's Cup. The other big opportunity that we have over the coming year is New Zealand will be chairing APEC, that is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. That's the good news, that we're the chair. The bad news is we're having to do it all virtually. That's going to be a serious challenge. We were chatting earlier before the address about the difficulties for diplomacy of having to do things virtually, and having discussed this with colleagues who have been negotiating in APEC this past year, which they've had to do virtually, and also friends at the United Nations in New York, they've confirmed what you would instinctively know, that it's a lot more difficult and a lot slower to get to yes if you're having to do it by Zoom and by email, rather than if you're in the room, able to grab somebody in the corridor or at the coffee lounge and have a really quick discussion to sort out a problem. But it is very important that we make progress in APEC, because it is one of those venues where countries who don't often get together can get together. For example, it is the one regional body that brings together the United States, China, and Russia. Not easy to get all those views aligned at the moment, but a good opportunity. And given that the world is going to be focused on economic recovery from the pandemic, it'll be a good platform for those discussions that we all need to have in an environment where it's all voluntary and there's nothing legally binding. It's hard, however, to think of too many advantages for virtual diplomacy. We're all trying to do our best, as you are, to stay connected. So on that note, thank you very much for this welcome opportunity to tell you a few things about New Zealand and about the strong friendship that we value very much with the United States. And on a personal note, I have to say it is really a privilege to serve here as New Zealand's ambassador to the US. My father, who's has long passed away, had the good fortune to travel and work here when he was a young man. So I grew up on stories of his visits to New York and the southern states, and he even worked on a farm for a while in the Midwest. So this was sort of the backdrop to my childhood. I never imagined that I'd have the opportunity one day to come and represent New Zealand here. But I do know these are difficult and troubling times in America, and your friends around the world are hoping that there will be better times ahead for you in the coming years. My husband, who is a keen student of history, reminded me that in the darkest days of World War II, President Roosevelt wrote a handwritten note to Winston Churchill in which he quoted some, of course, very well-known lines from Longfellow. And those were, "Sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate." So that's my moment to stop and hand over to you for questions or discussion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You can't hear